This week, Yossi Klein Halevi, renowned American-Israeli journalist and author, was recently in Minneapolis to talk about his book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. So TC Jewfolk editor Lonny Goldsmith and I sat down with him for a wide-ranging interview about responses to the book and American Jewish Zionism. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. First of all, some unrelated news. Jewfolk Inc. is selling merch. So if you want to support the work of this podcast, or Jewfolk more generally, a link to our Teespring store is available in the podcast notes. Right now, it's mainly TC Jewfolk branded products, but soon there will be products for our Who the Folk podcast, products with our Jewfolk podcast logo on it, and of course, The Jews Are Tired, stuff like, a branded pillow, blanket, and mug combo for when you feel just a lot of Jewish angst. You can also support us directly by donating, which will also be linked to in the podcast notes. None of this work happens for free, so we appreciate any support you're willing to give. Okay, now to Yossi Klein Halevi, a man with a long history spanning the movement to free Soviet Jewry, making Aliyah and moving to Israel while being a journalist, becoming a widely respected author, and being one of the most prominent thinkers and writers on what it means to be Jewish, American Jewish, Israeli, and everything related to those things as a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. His latest book is Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, released in 2018, where he focused on bridging the divide between Israelis and Palestinians through a series of letters to Palestinians explaining his Zionism and attachment to Israel and how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is understood by Israelis. A link to the book's website is in the podcast notes if you are interested in buying a copy. Klein Halevi was invited to Minneapolis to speak at Minnesota Hillel on October 12th by the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. The JCRC has also been running the Letters Project, a letter-writing contest to spark discussion and engagement with Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor in the Twin Cities community, particularly among young Jews. Lonny Goldsmith and I talked to Klein Halevi about what the responses to his book have been like, his views on American military aid to Israel, the divide between American Jews and Israelis, and much, much more. We had a blast during this interview, verging into quite a bit of unscripted and unplanned territory, and I'm grateful to Klein Halevi for coming on this podcast. Our conversation has been edited for clarity, especially as we spoke outside to be COVID safe. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Hi, my name is Lev Gringaus. I'm the host of the Jews Are Tired podcast.
Hi, I'm Yossi Klein Halevi, a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem.
And hi, I'm Lonny Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk.
So, first of all, let's just start out with, this is your first time being back in the Twin Cities since, I believe, 2018, when you were the featured speaker at the JCRC's annual event.
I remember that one.
How does it feel like to be back?
Well, before I answer your question, I'll tell you what was particularly memorable about that event was meeting Ilan Omar. And the JCRC had given her a copy of my most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. And she seemed very happy to have it. And we had a very friendly encounter. This was before she became the Ilan Omar that we've all learned to know and love. And what's so interesting for me in retrospect is to appreciate how the Jewish community here makes such an effort to reach out and has connections with all the different communities here. And I really saw that out in full force at the JCRC annual event. And it was beautiful. It was doesn't always work. You know? But it really is a source, I think, of it goes a long way toward explaining the success story of the American Jewish community, this uncanny capacity for reaching out and building alliances.
I think that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said about Midwestern Jews. We're normally flyover country. This is great.
I love the Midwest. Look, I went to school at Northwestern. It's true, you know, it's Chicago, it's Evanston, it's a little more urban, but you know, I really love the Midwest. I love the sensibility, the warmth of people, and the lack of cynicism. At least that's the way it used to be. I hope it still is. I don't know if the 21st century wave of cynicism has entirely passed over the Midwest, but at least that's how it used to be.
Yeah, that is definitely the nicest thing I think I've ever heard said about the Midwest.
I'll say one more nice thing, and then we can get nasty. But,
with pleasure.
And that is that Jewish communities in the Midwest remind me a bit of Jewish communities in the South. They tend to be very rooted, close, warm, and you know, I grew up in New York. It's a different, and I love New York, and I love New York Jews, but it's a different thing. And I was always touched when I encountered Jewish communities in the Midwest, and I've had a lot of that in recent years, being on the lecture tour and really going around, and the welcome and the appreciation is something special here. So you've got something good going for you guys. Don't shortchange yourselves.
It's delightful. He's buttering us up right from the off. I mean, I'm waiting for the other shoe now.
No. There's going to be a big financial ask at the end of this.
Exactly. So you mentioned your most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and it's become a bit of a sensation, I think, in a good way, largely, I would imagine, amongst American Jews. You know, in terms of the 3+ years since that book has come out, how has that been for you? And do you think it's achieved its aims when you decided to write it and then put out the I guess more recent edition with the new epilogue?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I had several goals or several audiences in mind when I wrote the book. Initially, I thought that I would write 2 books. After this one, I intended to write a book called Letters to a Young American Jew. Fortunately, I never wrote that. First of all, nobody would read a book with a title like that. And what happened was that as I was writing Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, I realized that much of what I would want to say to a young American Jew about Israel, I was actually already saying to a Palestinian. Now, there isn't a total overlap. If I were writing a book specifically to a young American Jew, I would have written a lot more about how do we integrate the Holocaust, for example, into a 21st century Jewish identity. What of that experience do we need to preserve? What do we need to leave behind? I would have had a more of an internal Jewish conversation. And I needed, for the sake of the integrity of the book, I needed to keep the focus very much on a conversation with a Palestinian. And it had to ring true. For the book to be authentic, I couldn't use a Palestinian interlocutor as a way of writing to young American Jews. I had to really write to a Palestinian. I'll give you another example. I wrote the book from a religious perspective, as a religious Jew writing to a religious Muslim. If I were writing a book to a young American Jew, I probably would have downplayed the religious side. But the only way that I felt I could have an authentic conversation as an Israeli to a Palestinian, as if religion was an animating part, even a key component of that conversation, because we are religious people. And most Palestinians are religious or traditional. And that's where I really felt that I had a chance, at least, of establishing some rapport. And it actually did work. I got lots of responses from Palestinians saying how they trusted this book because it was written by a religious person, even though it was Zionist and even, all of that. So my primary audience were Palestinians. The next circle of audience were Arabs or Arabic speakers, generally, people in the Middle East. The third audience were young American Jews. And the fourth intended audience, were my fellow Israelis. And in terms of the first circle, the Palestinians, I wasn't hoping to reach large numbers because, when you're in this conflict and you realize the depth of fear and anger and trauma that an existential conflict creates, there's just a limited capacity that people have for empathy or for even to respond to somebody reaching out. And what I was asking Palestinians to do was very difficult. I was asking them to read a Zionist narrative. Now, the book was translated into Arabic and put online for free downloading. And about 5,000 people downloaded the Arabic edition. I don't know how many are Palestinian, how many in the wider Middle East, but I did get hundreds of responses from Palestinians. Many of them were not pleasant. Many of them were angry. Some were hateful. A few were threatening. But I got a fair number of very thoughtful responses. People writing long emails, arguing with the book, sometimes expressing appreciation for the book. So what I was looking to achieve on the Palestinian front was find even a few Palestinians who would read the book, respond in a thoughtful way, argue about everything, but engage. This is my narrative. I'm inviting you to respond with your narrative. And let's model a respectful conversation over probably irreconcilable narratives. And I found not many, but I found a few. And to the extent where I was able to even model publicly with Palestinians what a respectful, painful conversation on our wildly opposing narratives would sound like. And we argue about everything. But what I was looking for with Palestinian potential partners was agreement about one thing. And that is that we both agree that this is a conflict between two indigenous peoples. If you can't accept my indigeneity in this land, or if I can't accept your indigeneity, then we have no basis for a conversation. But if we share the same starting point, that we are two peoples caught in a conflict between right versus right, two peoples in this little land between the river and the sea, who each belong here, then we can argue about absolutely everything else. Who started the conflict? Why isn't there peace? Who's responsible for the Nakba? Who's responsible for the collapse of the Oslo peace process? Argue about everything. So that's the Palestinians. The wider Arab circle was very, very good. The book has been reviewed in Arab media. One of Saudi Arabia's leading news magazines gave it a 2-page spread. And, nothing like this has ever happened before. And the reaction in America, which is really what you were asking me about, has been so gratifying to me and so moving, because it really it came out at a time when young American Jews were feeling more and more pressed to defend the Israeli story, to defend Zionism, and this book gave them a language of, on the one hand, standing firmly in your own story, and on the other hand, being able to reach out and empathize with Palestinian suffering without taking all the blame on the Israeli side. And that's the language I was trying to model. And now, finally, the last circle of audience is the Israeli readers, and the book has just come out in Hebrew. So I am waiting to see how my compatriots respond, whether they dismiss the book as hopelessly naive and starry-eyed, or whether some Israelis will find that the Palestinian responses are surprising and might even lead to some rethinking about possibilities between Israelis and Palestinians.
That feels like a weird quirk of the publishing world, that your book written in Israel about the situation there would only now get translated into Hebrew.
Well, there's a backstory. First of all, I wanted to wait before I had Palestinian responses for the book to come out in Hebrew, because the book, the main part of the book, the letters that I wrote, explain Israeliness, explain Zionism. Israeli Jews don't really need that part of the book so much. I mean, I do think it's potentially interesting for Israelis to see how an Israeli writer tries to speak to a Palestinian about Zionism. So I think in that sense, there is some interest. But the heart of the book, I imagine, for Israeli readers will be the epilogue, will be, so what did Palestinians say to that? I had my publisher said to me, okay, letters to my Palestinian neighbor. So what do the Palestinians say in return? And I said, well, you've just published the book. There's an epilogue there of Palestinian letters. And what I found so interesting about his response, he knows that there are Palestinian responses, but we're so wary. We're so demoralized about the chances of being accepted by Palestinians, of our legitimacy being recognized, that even when you publish a book, you're the publisher. You publish a book with Palestinian responses that do affirm Jewish legitimacy in this land. It's still, it hasn't sunk in. So the first reason why I needed to wait was to accumulate enough Palestinian responses for this to be of interest to Israeli readers. And the second reason is much more technical, and that is that I did not translate the book myself. My Hebrew isn't good enough for me to do the actual translation, but it is good enough for me to know whether a translation is good enough or not. And so, my book was translated into Korean. And whatever you want to do with the book in Korean is up to you. There's not much I'm going to interfere there. But with the translation into Hebrew, I was really a nightmare for the translator, because I sat on every word, and she was great. She was so patient. But I literally weighed every word. And when you write a book, you're not only using words, but you're using words in a certain way that creates a kind of music. every book has a rhythm. There's a musical language. A reader may not necessarily know the musical language consciously, but if you're connected to a book, you're connected to the music of that book. What I found in some of the previous translations of earlier books of mine into Hebrew is that the music can so easily be destroyed in translation. That's what you lose in translation is the rhythm. And so I really sat on this one. I decided I'm just not going to let the translator have, so to speak, the final word, and to really try to be as involved as the translator and as the process would allow.
Speaking also of other aspects of the past 3 years since your book came out, and tying into then the Israeli conversation, we've seen longtime Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pushed out of power by a bizarre and kind of amazing coalition of left-wing, center, and right-wing political parties, including an Islamist Arab party, which, many thought pigs would fly, no pun intended, before an Arab party would, join a governing coalition. You wrote in a Times of Israel blog in June that this new coalition gave you hope after Netanyahu's divisiveness. So how do you feel now, months later, about how the coalition is doing and how much they're embodying your approach to the Palestinians in Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor?
So it gave me hope, and now that it's been in existence for over 100 days, I'm post-hope. And I actually mean that in a positive way because
I wasn't sure where you were going with that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure either. I wasn't sure how I was going to get out of that. I knew what I wanted to say, but post-hope is when your hope is fulfilled. This government has fulfilled my hope. First of all, it exists. It stayed together. I used to get in the early days of the government, every Shabbat, I would just breathe. I'd say, we made it another week. And now I'm starting to take the existence of this strange and wondrous government for granted. And when I say strange and wondrous, there's no government like this that I can think of in the entire democratic world that brings polar opposites together to this extent. It's not only hard left and hard right. It's Avigdor Lieberman's frankly anti-Arab party with an Islamist party. The whole thing is amazingly insane. And it's such an Israeli moment because it's counterintuitive. And we went from, to my mind, the worst government we've ever had in the country's history, the most divisive. Netanyahu turned right-wingers against left-wingers, Jews against Arabs. He would wake up in the morning and think, which group can I turn against another group today? This is what we were living with. Now, you in America wouldn't know anything about divisive politics.
Not at all.
but we in Israel really experienced that over the last 4 years. And so now we have a government that's so improbable, but first of all, what keeps it together is desperation, this shared revulsion of Netanyahu's political culture, and a deep fear of Netanyahu, of the return of this divisive leader who tried to poison Israeli discourse and demonized our democratic institutions and the democratic ethos. So in that sense, I think we're so ahead. Just the fact that this government exists and Netanyahu is not in power, that already puts us ahead. But I think the government is really doing some very interesting things. First of all, it's investing in the Arab-Israeli community to an extent that no government has ever put those kinds of resources in before. And it's a confirmation of coalition politics. If you play the game, if you're an Arab party and you're inside the coalition, you will get budgets for your community. If you boycott the political system, your community will be left out of left out of the pie. So this government is a triumph for pragmatism and for the necessity of a common identity over our sub-identities that pull us apart. In other words, this is a government that's affirming that Israelis have more in common than what pulls us apart. And that's not something to take for granted, as you know from here. When the sub-identities, when the tribal identities predominate, become more important than the national connecting identities, a society begins to disintegrate. And that's what we were starting to experience before this government came to power.
So changing gears a bit, on the most recent episode of the Shalom Hartman Institute For Heaven's Sake podcast, you were part of a really interesting conversation about whether or not and how much Israel actually needs American military aid. This is in relation to the progressive House Democrats stripping congressional funding of $1 billion in aid for Iron Dome. In Israel, the missile defense system, it days later overwhelmingly passed, even though it hit a bit of a snag in the Senate soon after. So I guess we're sort of wondering, can you explain or as more broadly, the Israeli argument for reducing American aid to Israel from that podcast?
Yeah, I would say that my argument, at least, is not that we need to reduce the aid. I don't think we can or should, but I think we need to reconfigure it in two ways. One is there are systems that Israel helped develop, for example, the Iron Dome, that we can afford, and I don't think we need aid at this point in Israel's economic evolution. We can stand on our own to a large extent. Where we do need ongoing aid are in systems that we ourselves haven't developed. For example, bunker busters. If Israel is going to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, and personally, I don't see any way in which we won't at this point. I think that we have one of two alternatives at this point, which is either make our peace with a nuclear Iran, which we will not, or attack those facilities. That we don't need anyone to do that for us, but we will need certain systems to make that possible. More broadly, I would like to see Israel adopt an approach that Israel's former ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, recently proposed, which is to treat Israel the way that America treats Germany, Japan, Korea, as a recipient of military aid under the defense budget, not as a special category. When you look at the defense aid that America gives to other countries, it is at least as large, if not larger, than the aid that Israel receives. But undue attention is focused on Israel because we're not part of the defense budget in that way. We're a special category. And I think that the time has come in the history of our relationship for Israel to be treated as a formal ally and not as a beneficiary of aid. And I think that what grated some of us about the aid for the Iron Dome is that there was something of a handout mindset there. Let's help out these poor Israelis. Well, we're not poor, and we don't need help. We need partnerships. And in the same way that America has military partnerships with other countries, I think the time has come for that to happen with Israel. And one last point about the Iron Dome that upset me and concerns me, and that is that you're setting the bar too low in terms of support for Israel. And that is, okay, I can support aid for Israel so long as the weapons system is entirely defensive. Now, Israel, we find ourselves at war every few years with another terror enclave on our borders. No other country in the world faces the kind of threat on its borders that we face. America's big threat on its borders is that too many people want to become Americans. The threat that we have on our borders is that we have too many enemies who actually want to destroy us, sitting right on our borders. And so I don't only need weapons to protect myself against attack. I also need offensive weapons. I need to be the best military in the Middle East. And if that's something that parts of the Democratic Party can no longer get behind, then that's a real problem in the relationship. I don't need your help for Iron Dome. I do need your help in maintaining my position as the best army in the Middle East. That's a really dangerous part of the world, and if America feels that it is in its interest to maintain a strong Israel as a partner, then that needs to be the thinking. Don't be debating about Iron Dome. Let's debate about how to keep Israel's military edge.
So, among the many intriguing aspects of that perspective, what caught my attention on the Hartman Institute's podcast, something you didn't actually mention right now, is putting all of this in context of American Jews specifically, in the sense that you basically said that American military aid to Israel is almost more important for American Jews than it is ultimately to Israel, and that maybe that's not sustainable anymore. And let me just give a quote from what you said. What's positive is that we're giving American Jews the opportunity to turn an emotional attachment into a mitzvah, into a tangible act. Supporting Israel in Congress is an elemental mitzvah. And I certainly want to encourage American Jews to continue with these mitzvot, but maybe after 70 years, it's time to rethink the ways in which these mitzvot play out, end quote. So that's a very weird thing to think about for mainstream American Jewry, which has built an identity around, as you said, not so even the religious aspects of Judaism anymore, but oftentimes just bringing aid to Israel. So keeping in mind that, pointing out an issue doesn't automatically mean you'll have the answers to the issue, but what are the ways in which we need to rethink American Jewish support for Israel in a time when, in many ways, as you said, Israel doesn't quite need it? And to add an extra element in, at least under the Netanyahu years, Israel often didn't really care for the American Jewish support either.
No, I think that under the Netanyahu years, Israel did care for American Jewish support, just didn't care much about American Jews. Which is worse. Let's start with what American Jews, to my mind, need to keep doing, and then think about what needs to change. I think what is essential for Israel, and I think it's essential for the strength of the American Jewish community as well, is to continue its political support for Israel. And that means continue the lobbying, continue to make sure that the anti-Israel wing of the Democratic Party remains a minority and remains confined to the good state of Minnesota. So,
let's not forget my home state of Michigan and Missouri as well.
It isn't
Massachusetts.
It's all the M states.
Also,
That's
our
right.
libertarian friend currently holding up the Iron Dome aid
in Kentucky.
There is one Republican as well. That's fair to say. So there does seem to be a problem with the M states, but other than that, we're okay. So the first thing is, yes, keep the line on bipartisan support, and that's something that the American Jewish community is really adept at doing. It has decades of experience. And one of the things that I've always been so amazed by, especially in the last few years, especially under in the Trump years, is I do a lot of speaking for AIPAC, and I'll speak to congressional delegations that come to Israel under AIPAC auspices. And it's stunning to me to see these bipartisan groups of members of Congress that come. I've noticed less in the last couple of years, but still you will have some bipartisan groups coming. And I've asked members of Congress, are there any other issues where you all do these trips together? And they said it's only Israel. So in that sense, too, I think that American Jewish support for Israel helps Congress to maintain some minimal sense of bipartisanship on foreign policy issues. That's actually a gift to the American political system. It wasn't something that one thought would ever be really necessary, because a certain amount of cooperation between the two parties was always a given. It's not a given anymore. So I do think that the American Jewish community has an important role there too. So definitely maintain the political support, maintain the strong presence in Congress, and prevent the erosion of, let's call it, prevent the Corbynization of the Democratic Party.
Do you think that, obviously you said, you made mention how the Netanyahu government felt about American Jews more,
They took American Jews for granted.
Do you think that that's changing in
definitely.
the face of the new coalition?
Absolutely. I don't think that some of our leaders, including leaders in this government, understand how to change the relationship. But I think there's a great deal of awareness in this government in particular that something has to change. So you asked me really what has to change. What do American Jews need to change? But let's broaden the conversation. What do both sides need to change in the relationship? And I'll start with Israel as an Israeli. The first thing we need to do is begin respecting the forms of Judaism that you've created here. And I would even take that a step back and say we need to respect the Americanness of American Jews. And that's something that's very hard for many Israelis to do, because Israelis think, oh, well, American Jews, the more American they become, the more they're assimilating. And there's obviously a correlation there. But I think that that Israelis misunderstand about, first of all, how different America is from any other diaspora we've ever experienced, even with the rise of anti-Semitism. And also, I think that Israelis don't understand that one of the reasons that the American Jewish community is so effective as an advocate for Israel is precisely because it's so authentically American. When American Jews stand up for Israel, they're doing it obviously as Jews, but not only. They're also doing it as Americans. And that's something that I've learned from my involvement with AIPAC, just how deeply American Jews are. And what that means is that American Jews have no inferiority complex about pushing their political agenda. We have just as much right as you guys are laughing. What did I say?
No, it's just because I think often in the relationship between Israel and American Jewry, there's a sense that American Jewry is too much pushing its own view. In this case, you mentioned the Iran deal earlier as a perfect example of American Jews pushing their argument about what should be happening with Israel in the Middle East, arguably from the Israeli side, overmuch in an overbearing fashion. So it's just sort of interesting to mention that, for you to mention that as a positive.
Now we can have a good argument. Now we'll have a good argument, because I have still not recovered from the deep hurt that I felt by a large part of the American Jewish community not fighting the Iran deal. And the minority of the Jewish community that fought the Iran deal heroically, I was with them in that fight. I did a lot of speaking at that time on the Iran deal. I think the Iran deal is the single worst thing that America has ever done to Israel, has ever done to the Middle East, and in the context of the Middle East has ever done to itself. We can argue that. We can have a good fight about the Iran deal if you'd like. And I don't take back one word of that. And so what so moves me about the strong pro-Israel part of the American Jewish community is this feeling of American entitlement. We're doing this as American citizens. We think this is a really stupid plan, a stupid deal, not only for Israel, but for America, for the world. And we're going to stand up and say our piece. And a lot of Israelis don't understand that it precisely what makes American Jews so American is what makes them such effective advocates for Israel.
I am curious about this. I've been curious about this for a long time. I was often around many people who at that time opposed the Iran deal. And naturally, as someone who's younger, I'm only 24 right now, so you can imagine my age then, I sort of followed that. And then later I learned something that was curious to me, that for all the talk about the politics of, Netanyahu showed up and said, this is bad for Israel. On the political side, a lot of AIPAC saying this is bad for Israel. And then I learned about many of the Israeli generals and the defense establishment and the intelligence community that themselves said, either ranging from this is not perfect but better than nothing, or now that we have it, we can actually use it in effective ways. And then when, it was canceled under the previous American administration, many of those same defense and intelligence officials said, well, we could have used it. Maybe you didn't need to cancel it now, which has always been curious to me about the sort of division of the political Israel versus, for a long time, the words of the generals were kind of.
So glad you asked that
question. I'm curious about where you fall on it. I think that's a fascinating, and in America, we don't have that conversation enough because we're so stuck on the political divides of Netanyahu came and told us we don't like it this,
So I know of a handful of former leading figures in the Israeli security establishment who supported the deal, not necessarily passionately, but felt okay under the circumstances. The overwhelming majority of the Israeli security establishment did not support the deal. What happened was, once it became clear that we had no chance of stopping the deal, and it was clear before Netanyahu went to Congress, there was a letter that was signed by a large number of figures who were formerly part of the defense establishment, who said, this is a losing battle. We're going to lose more than we gain by fighting it. It's time to just give it on this. That's different, because that was not the support. Now, it's true that today you'll have many figures in the security establishment who will say it was a mistake to cancel the deal. I'm not part of the security establishment, and I do not think it was a mistake to cancel the deal by any means. What I think happened, and I'm going to preface this by saying I am not a fan of Donald Trump. Unlike many Israelis who are, and I understand Israeli gratitude to Trump, but I think that the damage that Trump did to America, the violence, this was such a violation, and that it was in a sense an existential threat to the America that we know, and an existential threat to America is a threat to the world. And so I even though Trump happened to have been the best president for Israel that we probably ever had, I don't think the trade-off was worth it. So again, many Israelis won't say that, but maybe it's because I've spent a lot of time in America, and I saw up front what he was doing to American society, to the culture here, and close to irreparable damage. But having said that, Trump understood the Middle East, and it probably takes a Donald Trump to understand the Middle East, the pathology of the Middle East. And what Trump got right was two things. One is that unlike Obama, who fantasized that the Iranians could become the linchpin of regional stability, Trump understood that Iran was the source of the region's problems, or one of the sources of its problems, and that this regime, this Iranian regime, will never be an ally or a stabilizer. And the second thing that Trump understood is that the only way to get a better deal, and I think he was after a better deal rather than no deal at all, was to apply more and more economic pressure till the breaking point. So what went wrong? What went wrong from the point of view of the deal, not from the point of view of your political situation. What went wrong was that the Democrats won the election. And I'm convinced that Iran was waiting it out. And I'm also convinced that whoever it is on their side in this country was telling them, don't give in yet. Trump might lose. And they were holding out, and they knew that when the Democrats came in, they knew that Biden would be desperate for a deal. And my big fear is still, even though there's been, it's taken longer than I thought it would, but I do not trust the administration on this issue at all, and I fear that they will give in. Had Trump been reelected, and again, I'm speaking very specifically on Iran, I think that the Iranians, faced with 4 more years of Donald Trump, would have had to renegotiate the deal, something that they don't feel any need to do with Biden, because they know that Biden, on this issue, is a pushover. Not only on this issue. I think the withdrawal from the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the disastrous way in which it happened, was a very clear signal to the Iranians. The Democrats are back. Relax. That's all I have to say about that.
That's all? Fascinating. I thank you for responding to that and letting me ask that. I have a lot more I would love to ask, but I don't want to make this just a big, podcast about the Iran deal, as fascinating as that would be.
And can I say one last thing about the generals?
Absolutely.
It's really interesting how in American Jewish conversation on Israel, I find that people here really care. What do the generals or the former generals think? So I know, for example, there's a dovish organization of former security officials who are for a Palestinian state, and I never hear about them in Israel, but I always hear about them in America. And there's a good reason for that. Nobody in Israel really cares what former generals think about anything, including security issues. Okay, thank you very much. And I mean this, I'm not being cynical. Thank you for your service to the country. But now that you're a civilian, you know as much as I do. I know as much as you do. We've all been in the army. We all know what the West Bank looks like. We all know what the political threats are. We all more or less know something, at least, about Iranian enrichment. What do you really know more than me? You are tacticians. And the way that a friend of mine put it, when the head of the Mossad, former head of the Mossad, came out for the Iran deal, he said, if I'm looking for someone to assassinate a terrorist, I'll go to the Mossad. But if I'm looking for a political opinion, my opinion is worth as much as the head of the Mossad. Now, it's hard for American Jews to understand that, but it's an essential part of Israeli egalitarianism, of the democratic ethos in Israel, which is we all serve the country. We all live these issues. All right, you have some inside information which helps you in battle, but do you really understand the political issues better than I do? Not necessarily. I listen to some of our former generals, and I think, what kind of a moron are you? We placed the fate of our country in your hands, and that's what you think, and that's a very typical Israeli response to what the generals think. And it changed in Israel with the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Before that, we revered our generals, and when they went into politics, they had the last word. This is a very different Israel today.
So many fascinating things I'd love to keep asking about.
Yeah, how many hours do we have to do? Okay, I want to switch. Taking up so much of your time. I want to switch tracks a little bit, because obviously, as Lev said, we could do the other track for a really long time. On Open Door Media's show Unpacked, you talked about the distinction between occupying land and occupying people. And the word occupation tends to feel very loaded here in the States, and possibly in Israel as well, when you're looking at the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conversation. So could you sort of explain the difference and distinction you make between those two?
Yeah, you guys really did your homework here. My starting point is that all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is the land of Israel. And Jews are not occupiers in any part of that land. A Jew is not an occupier in Judea. For me, it's all Judea and Samaria. It's not the West Bank. It's certainly not occupied territory. But that's my starting point. It's not my end point. My end point is there's another people between the river and the sea who I am occupying, whose lives I'm controlling. And I don't want the Jewish state to be in a position of permanent occupier. I think it's a disaster, long-term disaster for Israel. And so I support a two-state solution. I support the contraction of our territorial claim to what is now more or less to the borders of the state of Israel, in the same way that I will expect Palestinians who believe that all of the land between the river and the sea is Palestine. And I've never met a Palestinian, no matter how moderate, who doesn't believe that in principle all of that land is Palestine, including the state of Israel, whose starting point is not the same as my starting point. It's all mine. But in that same way, I'm expecting a Palestinian partner for peace to contract their territorial claim to what will be that part of the land of Palestine that will be the state of Israel. So what I'm really calling for is a partition not only of the land, but a partition of justice, because each side believes that justice is on their side. And I do believe that all of this land in principle is mine. And I never use the term give back land. The term that I use is giving up land, because I'm making a sacrifice of land that belongs to me, in the same way that a Palestinian would never speak about giving back land to the Jews. The state, I'm not giving back the state of Israel to you. I'm giving up the state of Israel, because the state of Israel is sitting on land that's Palestine. I accept that. For you, it's all Palestine. No problem. And because for me, it's all the land of Israel. So that's, for me, the distinction between occupying land and occupying people is basic to how I see not just the conflict, but solving the conflict. Each side has every right to its maximalist claim. Where we get into trouble is where each side tries to implement its maximalist claim. And that's something that leads to a dead end and war.
So finally, bringing it all back again to your book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. In 2020, the JCRC started the Letters Project, a letter writing contest to spark discussion and engagement in the Twin Cities community, particularly among young Jews. So what has surprised you if anything, about how young Jews have responded to this book? Any notable takeaways?
First of all, I'm really glad we're coming full circle back to the JCRC, because there is no other Jewish community that has gone so far in adopting and using letters as an educational tool as you have here. And it's extraordinary to me, really. The JCRC has gone all out. And that's a model for other Jewish communities. And I'm starting to see some interest in other Jewish communities in adopting the JCRC model, the Minnesota and North Dakota, is it? Or South Dakota?
Both Dakotas.
The Dakotas.
The Dakotas.
See, I always leave the Dakotas out when I speak about the JCRC of Minnesota, and I always get a very nice note from Sally or Holly. Could you please just include the Dakotas? So here, you see, I did that. I preempted the correction, and so no other JCRC has gone as far as you guys have. And that means an enormous amount to me, because part of my frustration, the book, it has resonance in the Jewish community. It's done well, but I just wish we could get this book into the hands of every kid that's going to college next year, because it gives you a language, it gives you a framework for dealing with the assault that's coming. And if when you ask me, Lev, what kind of responses I've gotten in the letters that I've gotten from young people who've participated in the JCRC letter writing contest, it's been phenomenal. They write letters to me, and it's so moving to, I invited Palestinians to write letters to me, and I got back, as I mentioned, a whole range of letters. I didn't really think I'd be getting letters from young American Jews. And I have this big and growing file of responses from participants in the letter writing contest. And most of all, I'd say what moves me is this sense of gratitude that I get from young people. That's now, and it happened especially during the most recent Gaza conflict. And I heard this over and over again. I had a context in which to understand what was happening. And that really, in the end, is the greatest gift that a writer can receive, which is the sense that your book is being read and is shaping people's consciousness. There's nothing else that a writer really wants or should want. Writers want lots of success and money, and we all want that. But the only thing that we really have the right to want is that our work can reach readers, and that you become a part of a reader's worldview, part of a reader's state of consciousness. And what an amazing thing that is, to enter into the mind of a young person and to be part of whatever's going on inside that mind, to be one of the voices that are competing with other voices for this person's attention. And so I feel privileged. I know that's a loaded word these days in America, but I feel privileged in the best sense of the word to be a writer for Jews, and to have the kind of audience that you here in Minneapolis and that you've given me. So thank you for that.
I think, thank you for coming on this podcast and being willing to speak with us.
This is delightful. Thank you.
Truly a pleasure.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news stories or reports referenced for this episode. There is actually a little more to the conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi after the main part of the interview was done, where we kept recording and had a good banter about the movement to free Soviet Jewry and some of Klein Halevi's journalism experience in the 1980s. If you would like to hear that, just keep listening. If I can also say, I'm a Russian-speaking Jew. My family came from the Soviet Union, so I'm also very grateful for your work against the Soviet Union back in the day. So
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
a note of appreciation for that
Yes,
as well.
I personally saved you.
Thank you.
You know, it's very funny. It's very funny, Lev, because I was speaking with Natan Sharansky a couple of years ago, and he said, every time I go to America, somebody comes up to me and said, I saved you. So what I said to Sharansky was, well, I have to tell you, personally, I did not save you because my years of activism in the movement ended just as you were getting involved. So by the time you went to the Gulag, I was not out there protesting for you. So
Look, you did
I'm
time.
sorry.
You went to jail for him.
Not for him.
No,
I went to jail.
I know you did it for him. I know you did.
It
That's
was
right.
for
That's
Lev.
true.
It wasn't for Sharansky.
That wasn't for Sharansky. No, you did good.
My family has heard the "we got you out of there" line when a synagogue was pushing my
Stop.
parents to donate because we weren't donating enough. Because when we first arrived, so a whole long story.
Who do you think you are, you Russian
Should I stop
Jews, you know?
recording before so we can tell that story?
I'm not going to do the whole thing now. No, but the other interesting part for me is like my parents were in sort of the first early wave in the 1980s. So my mom actually later got involved herself in the movement to free Soviet Jewry. And also, so it's kind of like I saved myself on that. And,
I mean, and I'm 46, and so my bar mitzvah was at a time where a lot of American Jews were twinning with Russian Jews who were of similar age, and so we had like a whole card insert in there, and I got
you twinned?
I did. I spoke either to him or I was on the phone. There was translators.
Probably the KGB agent.
I'm sure it was. And a significant delay because this was 1987 telecom. No, 88 telecom. How old? Yeah, 88 telecommunications. So there was, back in the day where there was the long delay when you had a phone conversation with somebody from overseas.
Many of those,
yes. Yeah. So, yes, but no, that was the very big thing.
How did it impact on your Jewish identity?
I'm not sure I fully got it at the time, to be honest. I was a day school kid too, so I guess I sort of got it, but being a day school kid, that I think impacted more at the time. I think if I wasn't a day school kid or I wasn't as engaged in the Detroit Jewish community as I was at the time, I might have had a better grasp, for example, of what it all meant, for lack of a better word, I guess, of what it all meant. I guess I also maybe just don't remember. I think, 33 years is a long time. And I might have actually had a really good grasp at it of it at the time. But I don't actually know.
Well, I'm really glad that 3 million Jews are not living under totalitarian rule. But, but I wish that young American Jews could have had the experience, that unbelievably energizing experience that I had growing up and that the Soviet Jewry movement gave me. But yes, on balance, I'm glad that we won and that problem has been solved.
Yeah, I've got a whole soapbox on how the American Jewish community sort of forgot everything that happened, and now my generation knows nothing. But I won't get in. The other important question I have for you: what was it like earning $2 a word back in the day for journalism?
Oh wow! $2 a word.
Was that low?
Who got $2 a word?
I don't know. I hear that was the going rate.
I worked as in the early '80s. I moved to Israel in 1982, and I was the Israel correspondent for the late lamented Village Voice in New York.
Sure.
And
Village Voice had a Israel correspondent. That's amazing.
Right?
That's phenomenal.
Think, and not only that, but a Zionist.
Yeah.
And think of what that means. I mean, this is a whole other discussion. But the reason, Lev, that I'm bringing it up is is I was paid, I don't know, $300 an article, and I would work for weeks on those articles. So it was nowhere near $2 a word. And if you factor in the time, it was a scandal. But I was so happy to be writing for The Voice that I barely noticed that I was really poor. So it was just a thrill. It was a thrill to be a journalist. And anyway, that's a whole other conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse about journalism nowadays, but
It makes
cool.
me feel so much worse as the guy who is responsible in getting him paid. Before he joined our staff, we're gonna.
Don't worry,
stop.
I don't hold it against you.
I'm just gonna go sit in the car and cry after we all leave. That's all right.